is a good thing or not? Let's bring in Dhiraj Nayyar, the Chief Economist at Vedanta. Mr. Nayyar, a very good evening to you, and perhaps you can shed light on this raging debate. These populist freebies, and I call them that because they tend to be looked at like that, at least here in India, the populist freebies that are offered by the government, are they really free? Someone is paying for them. Surely it is the taxpayer. Help us understand how deep an economic cost we are paying for such
Yeah,
freebies.
In fact, it's a misnomer that the government has money. The government actually has no money. I mean, of course, it has the ability to print notes, but otherwise, the money that it has, the budget that it has, comes entirely of taxpayers. And in developed countries, interestingly, normally, 65% of the tax collection is direct taxes, which is income taxes and corporate tax, and 35% is indirect taxes like VAT or sales tax. In India, it's the opposite. In India, the direct taxes, as you know, income tax, very few people pay. So it's the indirect taxes, which are 65%. So in effect, and indirect taxes, everybody pays the same irrespective of income. So they are not progressive in the sense income taxes are that the higher you earn, the more you pay. Or if you buy petrol, or if you buy, anything in the market, a shirt, you pay the same tax whether you're poor or rich. So in India, actually, it's the poor who end up subsidizing the so-called freebies disproportionately, or the lower income groups which end up supporting this disproportionately. So it's actually a mirage to think that these are freebies. That said, I mean, there's certainly a section of the population in India which needs support. But that's a fraction. That may be 10%, 20%, 25% of the population. Certainly, there's no case for 100% of the population in India to be getting freebies or subsidized goods. I mean, you talked about electricity, you talked about gas cylinders. Those who can afford it should pay for it. And those who cannot absolutely afford it, they certainly deserve the basics of life free. So we have to also understand, I mean, that's the principle. The point also is that we are not a rich country. So the countries you're talking about, Germany, UK, and so on, they have per capita incomes of $40,000-$50,000. We are at $2,000. So there is a limit to how much the government has in terms of what it can distribute as well, and it has other priorities like, do we invest in infrastructure or do we give it all freebies? Infrastructure is a better investment because it yields higher returns, it creates economic activity, it creates jobs. So when we think about this debate in India, we always complain about lack of jobs or lack of good jobs, and then we also want freebies. So in a way, I'm not saying both can't happen, but they can happen when you become much richer. So I think the key in India is that we must keep our focus also on growing the size of the economy, which gives people productive jobs so that they can afford.
And that's my question to you, Dhiraj Nayyar. Does the economy really grow? Because one argument can also be that, but like you also mentioned, the other side of the debate is that the people who are funding these kind of freebies, they're not exactly rolling in wealth. So how does that work?
No, so I think overall the tax GDP ratio in India is very poor. I mean, very few people pay taxes. I mean, even if so in OECD rich countries, your tax GDP ratio is about 35%. In India, it's 17%. Even in China and Brazil, South Africa, other emerging economies, it's 25, 26%. So India is one of the lowest. That itself puts a lot of stress on the government, because what do they invest those limited resources in? Whether helping the poorest, or in investing in infrastructure, or helping manufacturing. So those are all difficult choices when you have a low kitty. So I think certainly a priority is to raise the direct taxes component of the tax kitty, not the indirect taxes, because the direct taxes is what is paid by the rich. So I think that certainly needs attention. But ultimately, freebies, they don't give you, they give you a basic sustenance, but they don't give you a good lifestyle or a decent standard of living. Fine, when you're very poor, a gas cylinder, a toilet, a roof over your head matters. But after that, what? You still need a job to be able to afford the next level of consumption.
Let me ask you the question a little differently, Dhiraj. If the government has a certain amount of money that it can use for social good, would they rather put it in infrastructure building in terms of being able to give people the means really to kind of grow their own standard of living and in a way grow the economy? Or would they give sops like this, freebies like the kind we mentioned?
So as I said, the practice in India is that we kind of give freebies across the board. We don't discriminate. We give rich farmers who don't need freebies, and we give it to poor farmers as well, right? We give it to middle class and we give it to the poor as well. Subsidies on fuel, for example, for a very long time. So I think that is really the key, that you've got to rationalize the subsidies and the help to the population which really needs it, and then invest the rest in creating productive jobs for the economy, productive growth, productive jobs. So I think the key really is nobody can say that there has to be no redistribution or that nothing should be given free, but it should be given free for very select part of the population. And we have the means to do it now with Jan Dhan, with Aadhaar. We have the ways to directly put money into the bank account of people who need it most. So I think you can cut down your, and I think that's the difference between populism and smart economics. Populism is not discriminatory. It gives it to everybody, right?
Right.
So every universal basic income or give everybody free gas, but everybody doesn't need it.
No, so fair enough. So has the system been devised in a way that it does go to the people who need it the most? You're saying we have the means, but have you seen that actually work and go across to the people who need it the most? How have other countries done it more successfully than perhaps we have for the time period that we've had these means at our disposal?
No, I think we've done fairly well. In fact, and during COVID, there was criticism that the stimulus in India, fiscal stimulus, was much less than in other countries, which it was in absolute numbers. But again, I think the targeting was good in terms of the free food, free rations, give people what they really need in a difficult time, right? So I think we are managing that. We are giving targeted support, direct transfers to students, to pensioners, to farmers, and I think that's the way to do it. Different amounts of subsidies have to be given to different groups for different things. And that's the way you do it, rather than, and you subsidize, electricity, you mentioned interestingly. Now, there are two ways to do it. Either you make the electricity company give everybody cheap power, or they charge the market price and you give subsidies to those groups who need it, and they pay the bill with the subsidies. So that way, it's not indiscriminate, because otherwise what you have, and that's a classic example of subsidies gone wrong in India, is the power sector. Most of the electricity discoms in the country are bankrupt. And at some point, it's going to lead to a major power crisis in this country. So I think, indiscriminate populism, which causes inefficiency in the economy and which causes great stress on the budget, that is certainly something to be avoided at India's stage. I think at any country's stage of development, but particularly at India's stage of development, because there are huge trade-offs. And we need to invest, the government needs to invest taxpayers' money more productively.
More productively, like you're saying. So this wouldn't be the most productive way of doing it. We're living in very inflationary times right now, and a lot of it is spurred by the kind of crisis that we are seeing when it comes to oil. And that is really making prices across the board, whether it's raw materials for industry, whether it's prices that we pay for the products that you and I use on a daily basis. Everything is going up. In that kind of inflationary scenario, how does the government really decide what to offer as free and what to keep? Because that really determines the trajectory of growth for an economy through tough times.
Yeah. So I think, again, if you study the inflation, fundamentally it's coming out of fuel because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Oil prices are $100 plus a barrel, and it's coming from food, again, because of various disruptions and logistical issues. And then you have to understand that fuel is actually fundamental to the rest of the economy, because everything runs on fuel, your transport and your inputs and so on. So I think fundamentally, if there's one place the government should target at this point, it is fuel. So they cut some amount of taxes on the fuel product. I think they can cut a little more, because ultimately, that is what is fueling the inflation in the rest of the economy as well, including into food and into other commodities. So I think if there's one place where, and instead of subsidies here, so giving a subsidy on fuel and is like, taking money from one pocket and putting it in from the other hand, because ultimately the government is taxing you and then it subsidizes you to use the fuel. So instead of that, the simpler thing is to reduce taxes further. And state governments here can play a major role as well, because the VAT comes under them. And I think that will really ease some of the wider inflationary pressures in the economy, because I don't see, with fuel and food inflation, interest rates won't make much of a difference. So RBI will raise rates and try and anchor expectations, but ultimately I think you have to address food and fuel. So fuel, cut taxes, both center and states can do a little more. And in terms of food, if there are shortages or supply disruptions, we must import. So that fuel and food, which are fundamental to the standard of living of most Indians and to the inflation of the rest of the economy, we need to target those. I think if we can get those right, then we don't need to make too many more interventions.
For every time that we start speaking about the budget, Dhiraj Nayyar, we always speak about putting more money in the pockets of consumers, of citizens at large. Now, when you're offering freebies, does it work in conjunction with those kind of measures that are announced every budget in terms of the government's planning? Because certain times you're just reacting to a certain need that citizens by and large have. These inflationary concerns right now being a case in point. But when you're planning for a larger period of time, when you're looking at a budget for a year or even for what the NITI Aayog would do in terms of planning for years to come, then an approach for a country like India, what should it ideally be? How would they put more money in the pockets of citizens that they don't have to rely on freebies?
Yeah. So I think, again, the only way is to create productive jobs and to create higher paying jobs for a larger number of people. I mean, there's a certain section of people who have good jobs. There are other sections. I don't think unemployment is very high, but there are a lot of people who are underemployed or getting very poorly paid, working as subsistence labor in either the unorganized sector or in agriculture. So the task is really to lift those people out of their current state and give them productive jobs. And I think for that, freebies are not the answer. So the kind of thing the government is now trying to do with production-linked incentives for manufacturing, with capital subsidy for electronics industry, I think you need a much more healthier manufacturing base. Because if you look at the example of other countries which became rich and which offered good jobs for their people, they basically come from manufacturing. And I think until India, focuses on that, and luckily this government is focusing on that, I think ultimately only that will put more money in the pockets. Because ultimately, even if you keep subsidizing people, and this government has had to through COVID and other things, the point is that the government also has a limit, and somebody has to pay for all that excess expenditure. Either your government has to borrow more, so a future generation will have to pay for it, or the government will print notes, there'll be more inflation. So there's a cost to freebies. Whereas if you can get the productive sector of the economy to generate more jobs, then people can live on their own incomes, and those income and the spending they do from that income can then enable the government to collect more taxes and then perhaps subsidize those who are still left behind in a more sustainable way. But the key is sustainability and who bears the cost.
Yes.
But in the long run, freebies, cannot.
But you bring up a very important point, Dhiraj, which is about jobs. Now, this is a sore point as far as this government is concerned. Employment is of the kind of levels that they'd ideally like it to be. So in that kind of scenario, we see a lot of governments around the world offering freebies to those who are unemployed. We haven't gone down that route. But how does that work?
Well, we have the rural employment guarantee.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. That does exist. Yes.
So it's there for the rural areas. Of course, it's not there for the urban areas, and there have been various proposals to do something similar for the urban areas. But again, I think the Rega is fairly good and it functions fairly well. But again, it only offers temporary solace for people. It's not a long-term option of are not going to improve. But you will see it. I don't think we should be too impatient. Sometimes we are a little impatient in India, but I think in the next 4 or 5 years, you'd see the economy double. And when it becomes 5 trillion, 6 trillion, then you'll see the per capita incomes also rise to about $4,000-5,000, which is definitely a middle income country say. So that will happen. And then a lot of people will be better off, and you will have more resources to also give freebies or, subsidized goods and services to those who need it more. So I don't think we should be cruel about or fundamentalist about freebies, because certainly I believe that 20% of the population may need it in various areas.
Right.
But I think 80%, the rest of the 80% would be much better served if the government was to focus on creating productive and high-paying jobs.
Yes, productivity essentially is where it's at, isn't it, for a developing economy like India, and to be able to put it in useful projects and to make sure that a larger chunk is used for such means is going to help the economy grow and grow that much faster. But as a responsible citizen who does pay taxes, The question is always going to be whether the government sops and freebies are absolutely required. So it's a fair question to ask, and one should keep asking it whether a certain kind of sop, a certain kind of freebie is justified or not, which is essentially what we are doing on ET Now. And Dhiraj Nayyar giving us perspective on just that. A pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us and explaining the entire concept of freebies and how we should be looking at it even from the long term.